Hello, this is Nick Miller, Hickory Ledge. Welcome. Today I'd like to give you a lecture based on a paper that I authored for this year's 2020 C-Grade General Session on planning for resilience in high power systems. This talk and paper will be presented at the electronic General Session meeting in August. The version that I'm going to present to you today is a little bit longer and is based on that paper, which will be published at the time of the e-conference. The topic of resilience has gotten a tremendous amount of new focus and sort of taken on a life of its own in the last few years with significant regulatory and governmental emphasis. And there's lots of good reasons why resilience has been increased focus and is indeed the genesis of this particular exploration I'm going to talk you through today. So we're seeing at societal levels more violent weather, things like in the US, Superstorm Sandy and polar vortex. We've seen violent weather in Europe and also some societal impacts. So the ability of the power system to tolerate these events has been sort of a perfect storm with the transformation to renewable and many cases, inverter-based power resources. The institutional discussion of resilience has taken lots of twists and turns, and that's the reason for today's talk, where I'm going to focus on the possibility and requirement that the new classes of resources be an active participant in building the power system for resilience. And I start with this statement here, rather boldly made, that by looking at a broader spectrum of system disturbances beyond the kind of usual N-1 grid disturbances, we can make a system that is centric on renewable and inverter-based resources, more resilient and more economic than the system that it replaces. This is direct counterpoint and indeed the motivation for the talk against the sort of retro view that the industry needs to retain much of its traditional generation and infrastructure, particularly of the fossil generation variety, in order to make the system resilient. And I'm going to challenge that today. So overall, resilience is a little bit of a sloppy word. I will give you some of the more crisp institutional definitions, but broadly speaking, the idea is that we can do better for these big events. And certainly it was a seminal moment for the US power grid to be knocked so violently back by Hurricane Sandy, with extended outages, loss of life, loss of equipment, loss of critical loads. And while all would agree that it's not possible for us to build a power system that is impervious to all threats, regardless of how severe, there is in general a sense that we can do better. So that's the point here. Better can mean many things, some of which you can measure, some maybe not so. So we're really going to focus today on the shock resistance of the power system, with a view that there are characteristics that can be built in from the get-go that can result in better outcomes, better being fewer customers interrupted, fewer critical loads interrupted, faster, better restoration of service, fewer assets damaged, less environmental damage, and overall better economy. So with that in mind, we go into a formal definition of resilience that has been adopted by US institutions. So NERC has taken on the NIAC language in which there are 4 outcome-based abilities. Those are not my words. These are used by the NERC Reliability Issues Steering Committee report on resilience of about a year and a half ago, and are working their way through the consciousness and practice of the industry. So there's 4 attributes or abilities that we look for in resilience in this rather formal or somewhat formalized framework for considering resilience. The first is the ability to tolerate being whacked, shocks, and to keep serving customers. And I'm going to talk more about what shocks might mean above and beyond maybe the traditional view of N-1. The situational awareness, resourcefulness, the ability of the power system in its entirety to detect and manage as a crisis unfolds. You can consider that maybe in the language of self-awareness and agility. Recognizing my first posit, which is that you can't build to keep the lights on for everything, the ability to come back quickly and get critical loads in particular, but in general society up and running as fast as possible and in a controlled fashion is a key element. And then finally, the ability to learn from these events, which in general there's a pretty broad consensus that the world is getting a little more extreme, at least in terms of climate change and maybe other attributes as well. I have this call away at the bottom, which is kind of important, and that is, at what point does an extreme of weather go from being, an operational challenge to a shock, to an impact, to in a sense some sort of discrete event? I'm not going to try to unravel that, but there is a great deal of attention being given to the resilience aspects of resource adequacy, what to do for sustained days, if you will, maybe even longer, of violent weather, and those drive into do you have the right generation mix. For today's lecture, I'm really more concerned about more crisp events, like being hit with a hurricane, a wildfire, a cyber attack, earthquakes, other natural and man-made disasters. So this is a little bit of a retro look, or at least a ground-breaking, not groundbreaking, baselining imagery. And that is, we've got a social contract that the utility industry has done well and is broadly accepted, that says as events get more severe, there is not an expectation that you can tolerate everything, but you should be able to tolerate on this side a whole collection class of disruptions and keep the lights on, sort of N-1 planning. And then as events get more severe and outside of the thou shalt not interrupt loads, there's an expectation, there's a societal contract that says, don't disturb any more loads than you need to. And don't let the system cascade into failure and break into non-viable parts. And then finally, when things get really bad, you shouldn't trash the system. You shouldn't cause irreparable or long-term damage when it goes black. That's the reason for the black arrow, in such a way that you can't put the pieces back together and restore power. So this is very cartoon-like, but it is a space that people that have worked in the industry will recognize. Of course, this kind of level of smoothness doesn't really lend itself to many types of criteria for is it good enough, and consequently, the industry has established practice, of which I give some examples here, where these color codings, if you will, are parsed into criteria. And I use some of the NERC and WEC language down here. Primary cleared faults, relatively small events, shouldn't disrupt loads. As we get to more severe N-X type events, the system has sets of obligations that say these are the kinds of loads you may interrupt, or this is the consequences of the system. As we get to very high impact, low frequency, that's a language that's fairly wide use, although there are other choice of words that convey the same idea of stuff that doesn't happen or isn't likely to happen, but if it does happen, it's going to be real ugly, like a Hurricane Sandy or a wildfire. And in those cases, practice dictates that the system shouldn't shouldn't fall apart, should not cascade, and cascading outages are rather specifically. And then there's a whole class of practice that it's aimed at putting the system back together. So this is kind of the background that the industry is accustomed to using, and it's important because at the end of the day today, things that don't fit in these boxes and in the established practice don't lend themselves well to even consideration, much less investment or planning decisions. So what we're going to start challenging is as the industry increases its awareness and thinking about resiliency, it adds a layer or it adds criteria that needs to be built in or at least thought about in the course of the evolution of the power system. So, for example, we have a chance to do better, to use a sharper pencil. Not interrupt loads is not so important as don't interrupt critical loads. Some loads are frankly more important than other loads. And we don't do a great job, not that we don't consider that, but about figuring out what to keep, what not to keep, and how to design the system around that. And indeed, the notion that some loads are less critical than others starts to challenge the societal contract of keeping the lights on. Cascading outages are a no-no. There is a growing body of evidence and practice that says, hey, when the going gets really bad, we should have the ability to break off maybe into viable pieces. The microgrid community is very much of that school. Keep the microgrid synchronous with the bulk power system, but when the going gets ugly, consider separating those microgrids away from the grid, from the bulk grid, and keeping viable pieces alive, particularly if those pieces are societally important. And then getting things back together. That has always been kind of a tacit understanding, but the ability to invest and actively measure how long does it take to get the lights back on? What did you wreck? What can you count on? And what is the process by which you're going to bring the system back is evolving really rapidly, needs to evolve rapidly as the generation mix changes. So again, returning in some sense to a cartoon image, adding resilience is the idea that we're going to do better. More area will be green, the yellow will cover more severe events, red will be even more severe, and the breadth of considerations of events that we can at least take into consideration needs to be a lot broader than practice has generally evolved to. It's a real challenge for the industry, and we can't put ourselves in a position where we sort of go back to the good old days of having big chunks of steel to lean on. So for the balance of this talk, I'm going to focus on this last point, and that is, what do you want? What could we benefit? And what would be the resilience implications of making new inverter-based resources, wind, solar, batteries, various energy storage, have functionality that is specifically geared towards improving system resilience. So with that, I'm going to go through each of the four attributes identified and built into the NERC framework And I'm going to start with robustness. So in each of these next 4 slides, I'm sort of giving you what I've called an inventory of inverter-based resource functionality. And on the left here, I list a few attributes that are in today's inverter-based resources. Sometimes those are understood, and in some places they are in there but not well used yet by the industry. So the ability to absorb shocks, some of the stuff we've been through. So it's an important reference point for those that may be predisposed to thinking that inverter-based resources don't contribute to resiliency, or indeed negatively contribute and are part of a problem with the system being less resilient. So certainly, as an industry, we've wrestled with fault ride-through, which is in there. It's mandated. We still have a little bit of learning here and there relative to fault ride-through, but in general, those are in there. The ability of inverter-based resources to handle the dynamic behavior of the system in many regards is superior to synchronous generators. And a lot of times, those of you who have heard me lecture on that topic, on transient stability of inverter-based resources, will recognize that point. And there's already SIP rules in North America. There's basic compliance with cybersecurity, but building cybersecurity in is really important. But as we look forward, some of these things are in various stages of being given birth today. What more would we want for resilience? Relative to fault ride-through, this is a hot topic. Those who've been following what's going on in Australia and in parts of Europe, the necessity to tolerate a multiplicity of faults in close temporal and physical proximity has grown. Many of those requirements are starting to emerge for IBRs that are wildly in excess of anything that's ever been achieved with synchronous generation. A little bit of a cautionary note there. Each one of these additional functions may add some cost, maybe not. There's some questions about what the balance is of added cost to added functionality. Clearly, the industry needs to be asking these questions, deciding how much to spend, or even figuring out what it might cost. Physical toughening, okay, so stuff beyond fault grids like severe weather, physical threats, which I list here, right? We don't want the wind, we don't want the solar equivalent of the coal piles freezing in place because of a polar vortex and making the coal plants shut down. Those kinds of things fit. But bitter cold is a challenge for wind turbines. It's gotten better and better, but some of those things could be pushed further. Question of what the right economic balance is. The other thing is the ability to that spills from this bullet into the next one, which is having the resources have the ability to self-protect themselves, to go into defensive postures, which could include things like storm shutdown. Those are there. I list a few: extra cooling during extremes of heat, heating of key elements, additional defensive yaw for wind turbines. There's a long list of things that could conceivably result in IBRs being more physically robust, okay? But you need to have market structures. Say, hey, I'm gonna curtail myself in advance of this particular violent weather. Is there a market arrangement that allows that? Is that by fiat, whatever? So some of these things may be well-established practice for traditional generation portfolio that haven't been worked through with the new resources and the new business participants. The other thing is that cybersecurity is a real concern. We've yet to have epic scale cyber events, but IBRs depend on software and very high bandwidth communication in a way that is recognized by the industry as being different and possibly more vulnerable, although I think that debate is out, compared to heavy iron and copper. The next thing is resourcefulness. Okay, this is hey, what, bad things are happening. Back in the days of of, of the late 70s, when people were first doing research on emergency state control, this is our alert state or even emergency state. Uh, so you need to be able to see what the IBRs are doing. That's already happening with utility scale resources. There's a lot of debate as to what the level of observability and controllability needs to be for DERs. But those things are in there. The ability to control power, to provide grid services, to increase grid services under conditions of extrema. The ability to talk to not only the central station, but other SCADA functions in order to participate. So a lot of this functionality is there, but a lot of the practice necessary to take best advantage of these functions when the system is on the ropes has not been developed. The other piece of this, again, this is the column for additional functionality for resilience. Islanding detection, right? This has not largely been examined in the context of resilience. It's sort of been 1547, as many in the audience will recognize, been a bit of a food fight between the thou shalt not island, but thou shalt provide functionality that could support an island. The ability of these inverter-based resources to figure out what is going on and understand whether or not they are actually in an island or not could be taken way beyond what is required in 1547. There's all sorts of algorithms out there, whatever, but there is not a consensus on what is desirable. We need to do some work on that. Similarly, these IBR resources have the possibility to have a great deal of self-awareness. They can understand when something is abnormal on the grid and possibly be able to adapt to other operating modes, to recognize that it's in extremis or maybe has islanded or the system has broken up or has some other recognizable malady that require it to behave differently than as if the grid was intact. Some of these things are going to just be brains, and we might be able to get them in the resources for relatively little capital cost once we figure out what we want. NERC has recognized that. So this quote is from the NERC document. It says, utilize artificial intelligence and machine-to-machine learning to optimize the utilization of security, right? Take advantage of the brains. All right. And another thing is that many IBR resources are consist of a multiplicity of pieces, like a wind farm or solar farm. There is all sorts of possibility for these resources, for example, to recognize that parts of them are damaged and still return in part. Some of that stuff is already built into best in class, but most not, and particularly not with a view towards being a better citizen for the grid when it's in extremis. So there's a great opportunity on several of these fronts to make the IBRs be good foot soldiers during a system in trouble. Similarly, when the system finally goes down, which it will do, we have some challenges and some capability, right? IBRs in general, unless they're told otherwise, will watch for the grid to come back and will start to participate. Those are relatively primitive type functions at this point, but the possibility of having the startup be much more sensitized to what's happening as the grid comes back is strong, and the ability to program specific behaviors during system restoration could be a big help in system restoration. In general, wind and solar are left out of system black start calculations. It's too hard, it's too uncertain. They're inverter-based resources that have low short circuit level. Okay, there's a whole bunch of reasons, some of which are quite good, why wind and solar in particular are left out of system restoration. But that's a luxury that we can't continue to live with, and as an excuse to otherwise keep relatively uneconomic and less clean resources around, because we feel like we can't do black start is an anachronism that we really can't afford. But there is most assuredly work to be done on these fronts. The other thing is how do you get smarter? We're going to keep having events. We're going to keep having violent events, and each event is going to be different than the other ones. It's kind of the nature of the beast. So you can get, this is the war school thing. You don't want to fight the last war, and yet you want to learn from that. The reality is that the industry is doing quite well on that front. NERC practice disturbance analysis has been really good. I consider the response to the Blue Cut Fire event, which I'll go into today, the way the industry came together under NERC's leadership, to be an example that we should continue and frankly should celebrate. There's lots of ISO practices. It's not like the industry is sitting there asleep at the switch, anything but that. But there are possibilities based on the intelligence and the ability of these inverter-based resources to be self-aware and to probe. Ways of, for example, learning from very small events that normally wouldn't be on our radar. It's like, okay, the system is moving in this direction. We recognize that these types of damping problems are starting to show up, or that this behavior is evidence of increasing brittleness. Okay, so there's lots of ways that we can start teasing out information from the everyday stimulus, as well as from these big events. Drawing that intelligence in with better weather data, and that's on a whole bunch of fronts in terms of forecasting, real-time weather, very short-term forecasting, some of the great stuff that's looking at the 5-minute nowcasting tools. Those things are still in their infancy, and maybe I would get taken to task for that choice of words, but we've got a long ways to go. And using those tools, not just for better everyday operation, but for better resiliency under extremes, will make the assets more valuable. So we got some questions here, right? Do we really know are we even capturing the right information during these events? We have some risk of information overload. A wind farm with 100 wind turbines, there could be 100 channels of high resolution data of interest from every wind turbine. You start to get buried. Do we know what we're looking for? Do we know how to tease out insights from that so that we can make these things more robust? We've got tremendously agile and powerful both brains and brawn in these things, but they got to be trained. They got to learn what they're looking for. So I've laid down the gauntlet here on a whole bunch of new functionality that the industry should be considering in their IBRs to make the system more resilient. And I have to sort of be a wet blanket because we've been here before. It's like, okay, you could put all this good stuff in your next generation of wind farm or battery energy storage system, and somebody says, yeah, what's it worth? Tell me what the dollars are and why you're paying extra for all this fancy claptrap, and why is this just not gilding your procurement, right? We need to figure out better how to ask and how to prioritize our spend on resilience. There's a lot of work going on, and it's certainly not my expertise to try to develop metrics of resilience. So we got a yardstick to measure against. It's a two-edged sword. Those yardsticks, you get what you measure, and in many regards, we've had a lot of missteps in the industry, jumping to measurements that maybe not resulting in the outcome we want. So we got to leaven the measurements with engineering and good judgment. So in summary, and I think this is really quite important, the reason for me putting this paper together, first of all, there's a lot of functionality available in today's best-in-class IBRs that contribute to system resilience and could contribute more to system resilience if they were utilized with that in mind, and if rules and other things. So we aren't starting from ground zero in any sense. There are new functionalities. I've tried to list ones that I see as fruitful. Others could be proposed. We need some institutional will to really start to develop those and bring them into the stable of system planning. But we have a great opportunity here. We can make this next generation system more resilient, more economic, and cleaner than it ever was. And I put that down as a direct challenge against the idea that we just need to keep around extra fossil plants to make the system more resilient. So with that, thanks, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. I'm usually pretty good about answering email if anybody wants to connect with me.